like making everything
okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. I hope that people have been slowed by the cold weather. Although you think that would make you walk faster because you want to get warm, right? But welcome to the Center for Latino Policy Research. I'm Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, the chair, and I'd like to welcome you to our speaker series for this year. We have the privilege today of hosting Marisa Abrajano, who is an associate professor of political science at UC San Diego, and who also happens to be a good friend. And so it's especially exciting to have her here. Marisa got her PhD from NYU, but before she moved east, she was a UC person, although she was a baby bear, not a real bear. She went to UCLA. But it's okay, we like her anyway. Marisa, because she decided that one book just wasn't enough, has already published two. So she has her book called Campaigning to the New American Electorate, Television Advertising to Latinos, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2010. It is still, to my knowledge, the only full-length treatment of Spanish language advertising to Latinos in elections, and so it's really worth, she did a tremendous amount of data gathering in this work, and is worth checking out and looking at, and it was the winner of the American Political Science Association Latino Caucus Best Book Award in honor of its tremendous contribution to the field. And then along with Mike Alvarez, she published New Faces, New Voices, the Hispanic Electorate in America, which was published by Princeton University Press, I think also in 2010, right? Because, yeah, she wants to make us all look bad. And that book, if you really want an overview of sort of all of the research possible in Latino politics and a really well-analyzed sort of discussion of its merits and strengths, you should definitely look at that book, because it's the most comprehensive look at that literature. And so she does great work looking at media, looking at political communication, public opinion, and really thinking deeply about whether the theories that we have for the white population are applicable to folks of color. And so she's definitely one of the rising stars in our discipline, and we're thrilled to have her here today at CLPR.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you especially to Lisa for inviting me to the center. I'm delighted to be here and share with you one of my current research projects that I'd love to get all of your feedback and suggestions on. And the title of this working project is similar to the one on the poster, just a little bit different. But essentially it's looking at the effects of cohorts towards immigrants and immigration. And what really motivated this research, what really motivated this research, as I'm sure I don't have to explain to anybody in this room, are what we witnessed back in 2006 with the immigration marches in responses to the House Bill H4437. These protests, some of the imagery you see here, took place in 39 states in over 140 cities. And in just talking to some of my students as well, and some of them, many of whom who participate in these marches with youth themselves, was trying to think about whether or not these landmark events, these landmark grassroots events especially, can have a potential impact on individuals' long-term attitudes towards immigration. And that the extent to which these sorts of political involvement can have a long-term effect on people's attitudes. So given that immigration is such an emotional and contentious policy on both sides of the debate, this project seeks to understand the extent to which immigration policy can have these long-term effects. So there's been a good deal of research on immigration as it relates to public opinion, and there's generally three schools of thought as to what influences public opinion on immigration.
Sorry, I have bad technological mojo, and I think it's infused.
It's okay, I'll pause it.
Sorry.
So the first explanation that's often been provided for are these individual level characteristics. So demographic characteristics that some people have, such as levels of education, especially if you have low levels of education, have been found to influence you to have more negative attitudes towards immigrants. Emotions, such as those who have any racial prejudice, stereotypes, can also affect your attitudes towards immigrants more so in a negative way. Demographic changes, meaning sudden surges in the rise of the immigrant population, has also been noted not just in the United States, but also in comparative studies looking at other countries to influence attitudes on immigration. And then finally, the literature on group threat, which essentially stems from the power threat theory, talking about power and control between the majority group and the minority group. And we can basically think of three strains of threat that can occur. One, at the cultural level. So we all have heard this sort of rhetoric time and time again, especially in the press, about the onslaught of immigrants coming and what threat that has to the American identity, okay? Especially given that Latinos right now are the largest segment of the immigrant population today, to what extent they have on reshaping American identity, okay? Even academics such as the late Samuel Huntington have argued that Latinos, and especially Mexican Americans, pose this cultural threat to essentially what it means to be an American. Now, the other threat that can also arise from immigrants is an economic threat. Okay, essentially this idea or this perception that immigrants can take jobs away from native-born Americans. And then finally, there can also be a dimension of threat that's political in nature, such that immigrants may threaten or encroach upon the political power of the majority group. Okay, so essentially what we know about the factors that can influence public opinion on immigration are, contextual changes, or the contextual environment, also individual level characteristics that can have this effect as well. Now, there's another strain of the literature, or the research, I should say, that elite-driven theories, okay, meaning essentially the kinds of messages we get from the elites, primarily through the media, right, but also by political parties or politicians, but ultimately we learn about these messages through the press, could influence opinion formation. So in some existing studies have looked at the volume of immigration coverage, and has found that the more coverage there is that's devoted to immigration, that tends to have a negative impact on people's attitudes towards immigrants. Now, there's also related literature to show that when immigration is covered in the news media, it's usually done so in a negative fashion. Okay? That immigrants typically are portrayed as criminals, or an emphasis on border crossings as opposed to other frames that could be used to talk about the immigrant community. And so because of that, these messages have the power and the possibility to stimulate these feelings of group threat, whether they be economic in nature, political, or cultural. So this approach really looks at public opinion formation from this top down, where elites are basically having this big influence over the public. Now, the theory that I want to address in this paper combines two strains of the literature along with what we currently know about the factors that drive public opinion towards immigration. One has to do with Latino civic engagement, and the other has to do with cohort effects. So let me first talk about Latino civic engagement. So a few scholars, one of them in this room right here, has found that anti-immigrant hostility can influence Latino political attitudes and behavior. So Lisa's study from her book in 2005 looks at Latino youth in the wake of Proposition 187 in California, and found that participation in school walkouts and protests against the ballot initiative shaped their views towards government, public policies, and overall feelings of political efficacy. Okay, so that was one of the earliest works on this subject matter. In a more recent study that examines public reactions to the 2006 immigration rallies, from exit polls, they found that whites were more likely to view the rallies as having a negative association with Mexican immigrants relative to Americans who ethnically or racially identify themselves in the other category. On the other hand, Latino voters from this study felt that the rallies would lead to a positive perception of Mexican immigrants. So that study was the Cohen-Marks et al. Study, and so there they found differing impacts on these marches on on the attitudes of whites versus Latinos. So we know that periods where we see rises in anti-immigrant hostility here in the United States can be linked to political behavior. Now, the other part of the theory that we focus on is the literature that focuses on the importance of cohort effects. So the idea here is that exposure to landmark events during one's formative years can have a long-lasting impact on a variety of attitudes. Okay? So these impressionable years are typically thought of between the ages of 18 to 25. And these are the ages that researchers have thought about which your beliefs become crystallized. Okay? And individuals who pass through their formative years during these defined historical eras constitute a political generation characterized by shared dispositions or collective memories that outlast the era themselves. So in numerous studies that look at the effects of these landmark events have focused on, for example, the Vietnam War, other foreign policy events, Watergate, and economic recession. So in one study that looks at whether or not you were in your formative years during major economic recessions, they found that individuals who were exposed to these recessions had an impact in their trust of government, support for redistribution, and views on income inequality. So what we believe then is that that we can apply these theories and these periods of anti-immigrant hostility towards individuals who are in these particular cohorts and what long-term views that might have on their immigration attitudes. So we look at 4 landmark immigration-related events pertaining to law, okay? And we choose to only focus on laws or bills because of the fact that we wanted to mark moments in time where they became nationally salient to the public. And so these bills definitely got attention from the media. And so this is why we restrain our focus to laws or pieces of legislation, which is not to say that there are not other landmark immigration or events such as the Elian Gonzalez affair, but for the purposes of our research, we focus just on these 4 immigration bills. So the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act basically restructured the immigration preference system in the United States, making family reunification and skilled workers the main priority. Okay? And what's also very notable about this law is that it removed the quotas that had been in place, the racial quotas that had been in place since the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Now, amongst immigration law scholars, this law stands out as an anomaly, basically, from these other laws because it's much more open and liberal in nature than the subsequent laws. But it's important to note that even political leaders at the time when this bill was passed in 1965, particularly President Johnson and Senator Ed Kennedy, were careful not to publicly applaud the bill's progressive nature, understanding that general public resistance to increased immigration or diversity of the immigrants. So while today, in relative terms, we think about the 1965 bill as the most progressive out of all these laws, at the time it was passed, it was still considered to be a law that potentially had negative ramifications from the public. Now, the 1986 bill, we all know, is the Immigration Reform and Control Act passed by the Reagan administration. This was a bipartisan bill, which is most notable for granting approximately 2 to 3 million undocumented workers with amnesty. So this bill continues to be the only amnesty or regularization program that's ever been implemented in the United States. It also sanctioned employers for hiring undocumented immigrants and set up these fees as well. Now, in 1996, 10 years later, in the Clinton administration, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was also a bill that had some restrictive components to it. It strengthened Border Patrol funding and duties, employer punishments, and restricted government services to immigrants. Now, this 1996 bill came very shortly after the passage of Prop 187 here in California, which also eliminated social services to undocumented immigrants. And then The only piece of legislation that we looked at that was not enacted into law is in 2006 with the House Bill H.R. 4437. And as you all recall, the most contentious aspect of this proposed piece of legislation was that it was now going to, instead of a civic violation, it would now be a felony to assist, house, or enter the United States as an undocumented immigrant. Now, the reason why we include H.R. 4437, even though it was not passed into law, is given the enormous grassroots mobilization that happened with respect to this bill, and therefore the kinds of attention that it got, especially at the national level. Now, what we believe is that the passage of these immigration laws could stimulate group threat responses by making salient not only the concerns about the consequences of immigration, but also those that merit national attention and policy making. Okay. And so the main questions that this project poses are twofold. One is whether or not landmark immigration events, such as the legislation I just outlined right now, can leave a permanent mark on an individual's views towards immigration. And the second question is whether or not we expect the impact of these bills to be equal across all ethnic and racial groups in the United States. Now, with respect to the first question, okay, we contend that the passage of these immigration laws, like I was talking about before, what it does is stimulate these group threat responses. Okay? And so because of that, we believe that they can have these long-term effects, not only towards your attitudes towards immigration policy, but also how you think about and how you view immigrants themselves. So basically, your attitudes towards particular immigrant groups, which is what we're going to test. And then our contention with respect to the second question is that we expect important variations to occur according to ethnic and racial groups. Okay? Given that Latinos were the main target of the 3 subsequent bills that we're focusing on, we think that their response to these immigration moments are going to differ markedly from whites as well as from blacks. Now for whites, because they are the majority group in the population, we feel like the stimulus of group threat is going to make them react negatively to immigrants, whereas for blacks, we expect their views to change depending on their out-group versus in-group status. And I'll talk about that more in just a little bit. So let me just lay out what our basic hypotheses are for each group. So for whites, what we expect were those who were in their formative years during each of these 4 cohort periods, okay, so each of the legislative periods, will harbor more negative feelings towards immigrants themselves, okay? And we also expect that their views towards immigration policy will be of a restrictive position when compared to individuals excluded from these cohorts. So as the group literature suggests, the dominant and largest racial group in the US, whites, will react negatively to immigrants if those immigrants seem to threaten the status quo, resources, or opportunities for the dominant group. Okay. And we also believe this to be true for their attitudes towards immigration policy. Now, for Latinos, we don't expect the same dynamics to be taking place. For Latinos, what we expect is that they will adopt a more pro-immigrant position on immigration policies and hold more sympathetic views towards immigrants relative to Latinos outside of these cohort groups. So we can imagine that Latinos from each of these groups may have personally experienced hostility towards them based on their racial or ethnic identity, or have ingrained memories about the rise of anti-Latino sentiment during these specific periods, okay, which is consistent with the work that Lisa and others have done. So this in turn could have activated feelings of ethnic or racial group identity and solidarity. Now, our hypothesis on blacks is a bit more nuanced. We don't expect the relationship to be as straightforward. What we think is happening is, or what we expect to happen, is that blacks from this earliest cohort are going to possess less positive views towards immigrants and immigration relative to those not in this cohort group. Okay. However, what we expect to happen is blacks in the 3 other cohorts will exhibit more positive dispositions towards immigration. So the 1965 cohort of course, was passed during the Civil Rights Movement. So the fact that this law took a more open stance towards immigration may have stimulated concern amongst African Americans who were at the time fighting for their own rights within the country. So it's possible then that the group threat stimulus may have also been activated for African Americans. They may have perceived the influx of immigrants as a threat to their own economic interests and well-being. Okay. Now, however, we predict that for blacks in the later cohort periods to behave similarly to whites, both in their feelings towards immigrants as well as their policy attitudes, since new immigrants would also pose a threat to their economic, social, and political status. So what you can see here, or this quote you can see is from an interview that was conducted by Dr. Leonard Fuchs of Brandeis University that we found in the New York Times. And what he states, this was taken from 1986, immediately after IRCA, he says that traditionally the black leadership and community strongly opposed immigration as a direct threat in jobs and services. Today, blacks and Mexican Americans have forged an alliance on immigration questions, and black opinion is in general, is more sympathetic. So what we think is happening amongst African Americans, that there are these changing in-group and out-group distinctions, are key to understanding how different groups within the American public are perceiving immigration. All right, so the way that we test these hypotheses is by focusing on a data set that's quite popular amongst political scientists, the 2008 American National Election Survey. And what's particularly notable about the 2008 American National Election Study is that it's the first time that minorities were ever oversampled.
Or that more than one group of minorities.
That's right.
Of course, you can only ever do one.
Since it's been in inception since 1960, Lisa?
1956.
1956. So it wasn't until 2008 that the National Election Survey recognized that there were...
That's another talk.
This is true. But just for all of you who are political scientists out there, it took us a long time to update. The United States was becoming increasingly diverse. So the upside, so that meant that it was the first time that you could take the NES in Spanish. Okay. So there was approximately 500 Latinos interviewed, and the sample size of blacks was about 500 as well. So just to give you guys a kind of context to understand this, and before the 2008 NES, there were like less than 100 of Latinos and blacks that were interviewed, making it therefore possible to use the NES to make any sorts of comparisons amongst ethnic and racial groups. So the upside is, with the latest NES, and hopefully from here on out, we can use this data now to make meaningful comparisons across different ethnic and racial groups and not just focus on white American political attitudes exclusively. So the main explanatory variable, or independent variable of interest, are these cohort effects. So what we would want to do is to capture each of these separate cohort variables distinctly, because for some groups we expect the cohort to behave in different ways. So basically what we just do is create a dummy variable whether or not you were in the cohort, coded as 1, 0 otherwise, okay? And just to give you a breakdown of what that actually looks like, so what we did was we matched whether or not you're between the ages of 18 to 25, if you were in that cohort, and what the corresponding age would be in 2008 when the NES was taken. So if you were between the ages of 18 to 25 in 1965, those would be your ages in 2008. And the same thing with IRCA, IRERA, and then HR 4437. The nice thing about these particular cohorts is there is no overlap, as you can see. So everybody is in a distinct cohort group, and then we also have a sizable number of respondents who were in none of the cohort groups as well. Now, we also control for demographics and context. So demographics, the ones that I talked about earlier, that we may expect to influence immigration attitudes, so your level of education, your income, your age, okay? And then also we consider context. And by context, we capture the percentage of the foreign-born, the change in the foreign-born population for the state where the respondent lives. And then also, because the existing research is also suggesting that whether or not you live in a border state can also influence your immigration attitudes. So we also consider the possibility that if you live in a border state, you may also have distinct views on immigration. So those are the two contextual variables we take into account. Our dependent variable, like I mentioned before, can be broken down into two categories. Basically, what your attitudes towards immigration are, immigration policy, versus as well as your attitudes towards immigrants. So the way that we measure attitudes towards immigration policy are on three questions. The first question is whether the number of immigrants from foreign countries coming to the United States should be increased or decreased. And the response category was basically increase a lot to decrease a lot, so it was this 5-point scale. The second policy question was whether recent immigration levels will take away jobs from people already here. And then the final policy question is whether or not the federal government should spend more money on border security. And again, the response category there was a 5-point scale saying more spending to less spending. Now, the measures, or what we use to capture immigrant attitudes, are feeling thermometers. So feeling thermometers are basically these 0 to 100 scales that a respondent is given, and you're asked to place your relative warmth to a particular group using this 0 to 100 scales. Okay, these thermometer scores came out of the psychology field, and it's a very effective way of tapping into affect or emotion. Okay, since the question itself doesn't prompt you in any sort of direction, basically what it's just asking is how you feel towards a political group. So in the NES, they have two questions. One that asks feeling thermometer for undocumented immigrants specifically. Okay, they don't include a question just about immigrants, so just undocumented immigrants, and then a feeling thermometer on how we feel about Latinos. And the reason why we also look at Latinos is because there's been a growing number of research to suggest that in the United States, when we're talking about immigrants, there's also a strong association or correlation to thinking about Latinos as immigrants, right? And especially the association of Latinos and the imagery of being an undocumented immigrant. So this is why we use both of these feeling thermometers to tap into people's attitudes about immigrants. Okay. So before I turn to the results, I'd like to show here just some evidence to validate the salience of these events, okay, of these immigration policies. So here what we did was we conducted a content analysis of New York Times articles from 1960 to 2010 that basically make any mention of immigration. Okay, and the triangles on this graph indicate when the law was being discussed in the papers, not necessarily the date that it was passed. Okay, and as we expect, we do see in most of these periods an increase in media coverage, particularly during the years of 1964, 86, 96, and 2006. You can also see here that in 1994, which is right here, there was also a surge in media coverage, which we think is related to California's Prop 187. We have more fine-grained analysis that we just finished coding to suggest that, and to validate the idea that when immigration is discussed in the media, it's often done so from a negative tone. Okay. So you can imagine that when immigration is talked about, it's usually not done so in a favorable light, okay, which we think has important effects on how people respond to immigrants and immigration policy. Okay, and also existing research by Chavez has shown that media coverage of immigration tends to be negative. His focus is more on magazine articles and magazine covers, but we believe this to be supported as well in our content analysis of just this one newspaper. So this kind of gives us some good sense that what we believe to be these important events, the media is also picking up on to be important as well. And just another interesting thing to note is that you definitely see this upward trend in how the media is covering immigration. Okay? which sort of leads us to think that in a lot of people's minds, the saliency of immigration over time, you can imagine, is probably starting to increase. Okay, so let me talk about the results, and I've broken this down for each ethnic and racial group. And so here you can see the impact of cohort effects on white opinions towards immigration. Okay, and sorry, no, this title is wrong. This should be white opinions towards immigrants. Okay, so the feeling thermometer. So these are the feeling thermometer results. On the second column is feeling thermometers towards Latinos, and feeling thermometers towards the way that NES framed it was illegal immigrants. Okay. And what you can see here is that there are very strong and robust effects of these cohort coefficients for each of these feeling thermometers. So for all four cohorts, okay, so if you were in the 1965 cohort, and these are just for whites, you were less likely to have, or your favorability towards illegal immigrants, right, on the 0 to 100 thermometer scale, shifted to the left by 8 percentage points. Okay, so think about this as an 8-point shift on the 0 to 100% scale, so almost 10%. The biggest effect that we see is amongst the 1996 cohort, where their views on the, or their ratings on the feeling thermometer would move by about 10%. Right? Now, if you think about this in relative terms, if you look at the other coefficients, okay, these cohort effects are in some cases larger than your political characteristics, okay? So larger in magnitude than being a Democrat or being Republican, right? And much, much larger than any of the demographic characteristics that you think about. So so from a relative standpoint, that's telling, because these cohort effects are exerting a pretty substantial effect on your relative warmth towards illegal immigrants. Now, looking at feeling thermometers towards Latinos, what you can see is that there is a strong correlation there in terms of their exposure to these landmark immigration events and their attitudes towards Latinos. For 3 out of the 4 cohorts, these attitudes basically become negative as well. So with the exception of the 1965 cohort, being exposed to any of these landmark immigration events moves you, again, to the left of the feeling thermometer scale. So basically, less warmth, less affect for Latinos. So this is suggestive of at least for amongst white Americans, that these cohort effects are having a pretty substantial effect on their immigration attitudes today, or especially their attitudes towards immigrants. Now, when we look at their attitudes towards immigration policy, okay, the cohort effects are not as substantial. As you can see, it's only the 1986 cohorts that are having effect, and basically it's a negative one at that. So for example, if you're in the 1986 cohort, this makes you more likely to believe that immigration is taking jobs away. Same goes for the 1986 cohort. You're more likely to favor decreasing immigration levels by a lot. All right. So, and then finally, amongst the 1965 cohort, those who were in this particular group supported an increase on federal budget on border security. Right? So while the cohort effects aren't as strong as they are towards attitudes towards immigrants, we can still see that for the 86 and the 65 cohorts, this leads them to have more restrictive views towards immigration. Now, when we look at the results for Blacks and Latinos, what we see is that its effects are not as sizable. Okay, as you can see, Black opinions towards immigrants, cohort effects are not having an influential effect towards their attitude, towards their warmth towards illegal immigrants, but primarily towards Latinos themselves. And what we see here is that the effects are actually going in different directions. For the 1965 cohort, okay, it provides less affect for Latinos, whereas for this latest cohort, meaning the youngest generation of African Americans, it's actually being part of the protests, or I'm sorry, being exposed to these protests actually moved them to the right, indicating greater warmth for Latinos. So what this suggests is that unlike what we saw on white opinions, okay, for blacks, there seems to be greater affinity for Latinos amongst this younger generation, right? Which is markedly different from what we saw with our white respondents. Now, finally, for black opinions on immigration, what we see is that there aren't really that sizable in terms of the cohort effects. Okay, again, it's once again this 2006 cohort, right? And again, their attitudes are as consistent as the ones that they had towards immigrants. Being in this 2006 cohort made you less likely to want to decrease current immigration levels by a large degree, right? Which again is further indication that there's something distinct about this cohort and the way that this event influenced them into having more sympathetic views towards Latinos and immigration in general. The 1996 cohort is the only other cohort that who's had an influence, and there was on the issue of increasing federal budget spending on border security. And for that particular cohort group, that had a negative effect. So they were less likely to support this increase in border security, which once again suggests that there is a difference or a growing solidarity amongst these later cohort groups of African Americans towards the issue of immigration policy itself. Okay. Now finally, I want to talk about the effects of cohorts on Latinos. Again, these are Latino attitudes towards immigrants. And what we see here is that Latino cohort groups' effects were rather minimal amongst this population. Only the two latest cohorts, those from the 96 cohort and the 2006 cohort, were influenced in their feeling or in their attitudes towards Latinos. But what you can see is that these effects are positive, right? As opposed to what we saw with whites that had a totally opposite effect. So if you were in the 1996 or 2006 cohort, that made you more likely to indicate warmth or affect for Latinos, right? And these effects are not as sizable. It's just about a 5 percentage point move in the 0 to 100% scale. It still supports our hypothesis that because Latinos were the main targets of these policies, that we would expect to see their feelings of ethnic group solidarity to increase and become more salient, and therefore making them more having closer feelings towards their own co-ethnics. These final sets of results focus on Latino attitudes towards immigration. And what you can see here is that, consistent with what we saw for blacks, the cohort effects did not exert such a big impact. The only issue where cohort effects mattered had to do with the likelihood that immigration would take jobs away. And what we see here is that if you were in either the 1965 or the 1996 cohort, you were more likely to believe that immigration would not at all take jobs away, which again is consistent with our expectations that these exposure to these landmark effects would operationalize differently and would operate differently amongst Latinos since they were the main targets of these policies. Now, on these other two policy questions that we look at, we don't see any effects of cohorts, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why that might be the case in just a sec. So we did consider some alternate scenarios and robustness checks to make sure that what we were finding was really correct, or hopefully what we think is correct. So first we did a couple of placebo tests. One, we used opinions on Bush's handling of the economy as a dependent variable. So if we wanted to make sure that what we were picking up was really this relationship between cohort effects and immigration and not just some random or spurious correlation. So instead we used another policy issue, okay, and as And when we use this as a dependent variable, none of the cohort effects reach statistical significance. Okay, another possibility, and something that many of you might have thought about, is that immigrants are not just comprised of Latinos. Okay. So why is it that we've just focused on Latinos as a feeling thermometer? Well, luckily the NES also has a feeling thermometer towards Asians. So when we substituted, or when we ran our analysis but used Asians as the main group, okay, on the feeling thermometers, none of the cohort group effects were significant at all, which suggests to us that it's really something about being Latino that's driving these attitudes and not about any other immigrant group. Unfortunately, Asian was the only other large immigrant group that was asked about in the NES. But seeing that they're the second largest immigrant group in the nation, we thought that was a pretty good robustness check. And then there's also the possibility that other major events were occurring at the same time in the years that we looked at. Okay? One possible explanation is that there was unexpected surges in the immigrant population that happened to coincide with the passage of these landmark immigration events. So we looked at these particular years, 1965, 86, 96, and 2006, and there was no marked change in the surge of the immigrant population this time, which sort of makes us confident to say that it's not necessarily something else, such as a rapid growth in the immigrant population that's driving these immigration views. So from the analysis that we've conducted, what we can see is that, especially for whites, there was a clear and consistent relationship between these landmark immigration events and attitudes towards social groups, okay, especially towards immigrants and Latinos. However, these cohort effects seem to have a much less systematic effect or relationship between the policy events and attitudes on immigration policies, which seems to suggest then that being exposed to these important immigration events is really driving our attitudes towards different groups in society more so than on our public policy views. And finally, the immigration views of the major ethnic racial groups, okay, are not only shaped by individual characteristics, emotions, or environmental factors, but as we've demonstrated, also by the timing of their exposure to landmark immigration events during these formative years. And what we found is that because most of the political attention by way of the media has been negative in nature, right, what we've concluded is that it's led whites to harbor more negative sentiments towards immigrants' role in society, the current levels of immigration, as well as their overall evaluations of both undocumented immigrants as well as for Latinos. Okay. So the fact that there's so much negativity that surrounds immigrants as well as Latinos, okay, doesn't really bode well for these two groups, since these unfavorable sentiments can have long-lasting effects on how young Americans view immigrants as well as their feelings towards them. Not only today, okay, but as the research has shown, over the course of their lifetime. So something to think about is that if these threats derived from immigration persist in their prominence, it's likely that we will continue to have a public that's increasingly divided over immigration. And it's also likely that we will have a public that's going to become increasingly hostile towards a sizable percentage of the American population. So targeted groups may respond to such hostility by tightening their own intergroup bonds, contributing to further segregation within society. And so those are just some of the implications that these findings suggest, and I welcome all of your comments and feedback on this topic. Thank you.
Questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
You said in the survey, the way that they frame, you said they use the term illegal, right? As
Yeah.
a frame.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that could have affected how people responded versus a term like undocumented or even just an explanation, right? So immigrants without, just having an explanation. Like, I just wonder if because the term's loaded.
Yeah.
And I wonder just to what extent that could have influenced how people responded on the survey.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been personally the belief that this frame matters tremendously. I've seen a couple of new research studies though that have come out where people don't really seem to get the nuances between them. So I saw one recent experimental study that the political science did at Davis, and he varied the words undocumented versus illegal, and it didn't seem to change people's attitudes. So I was really surprised by that because I thought that the frame would really, really matter. But I mean, that's just one study that I've looked at. I mean, some arguments that I've heard related to that, is it's just so embedded in our society, in the public, about how we think about immigrants, that no matter what frame we use, the associations we make with them are still going to be overwhelmingly negative. So whether we use undocumented, whether we use illegal, it's still going to exert the same type of response from somebody. I mean, I definitely think it's an area of that would warrant more research, but at least that's what I've read from some recent studies.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for the presentation.
Sure.
I was wondering, however, as you were speaking, to what extent are you thinking about 1965 as, in the same way as you're thinking about 86 and 96 and all the different years? Because I can't help to think that, you know, the civil rights movement is just exploding. Even in like your graph on New York Times articles, I mean, that triangle was very low for 1965. And so although I understand the trends that you find for whites, I'm wondering if the explanation is different. If the explanation for 86, 96, and 2006 might well be exposure to landmark, you know, immigration policy changes, but in 1965, that motivation might not necessarily be that. I mean, it wasn't as widely covered. What was much more covered was the civil rights movement, it was the mobilization of Latino political groups. So maybe if the last 3 years are the exposure to this policy change, but that first 65 cohort might just have been motivated by just larger, you know, multiculturalism arguments, or if that sort of causal argument for 1965 might just be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Especially because even if there were, and I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the extent of mobilization that happens in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was not necessarily around in 1965, around immigration. You do find it in the later years among, especially Mexican-American political groups, around sort of affirmative action and civil rights and things like that. But 65, you had nascent, and if they happened, they were more to be in elite circles amongst congressmen and things like that. And you would find some congressional debates, but nowhere near sort of the larger political mobilization. So I'm wondering if, I don't know how that figures in, if sort of just, maybe this is just a precaution to be careful about the way you frame sort of the causal political context and what that means for the 1965 cohort.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point because it's something we've struggled with because, so when we were doing some of this archival research to see what was actually happening in 1965, because there isn't as much, we don't know as much about it as sort of in the later decades. And yeah, it certainly could be that we're picking up a lot of sentiment towards civil rights.
You might want to code your 65, you might want to code your 65 articles. So my hunch would be the articles about immigration that are in 86, 96, 2006 will most likely contain sort of passages, I mean, this is an empirical question, but I'm pretty sure this is what you'll find. Well, you'll most likely find passages and arguments about sort of Mexicans, Latinos, but that 65 sort of argument will be much more varied.
About immigration.
It'll be about Asians. It'll be about Europeans. It'll be much more about multiculturalism, and it'll be framed much more in a larger sort of civil rights. You know that from my, you know,
national origins is discriminatory.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
foreign policy and things like that. Versus, you'll find a much more consistent relationship, which then things, if the cause, I'm going on, but if the causal.
No, I mean, the good thing is we just, I think I mentioned, we just finished doing a continent analysis, and we did code for specifically if there was a mention of policy and what ethnic group or racial group was being discussed about, so we can get more information of what exactly was going on here. Because I mean, it's certainly the case that this bill does stand apart from the ones that happened from the 80s onwards. And initially, like I said, we were struggling with this, and originally this project just looked at the 80s onwards and didn't go back to 65. But then when we were doing more research and saw that in 65, it wasn't as if there was great, overwhelming support for this legislation too, start getting us to think that, you know, the same dynamics could be happening as well. I think once we get more into understanding what the coverage was like, we'll have a better sense of
Maybe,
what
but you still have the number is quite
yeah,
small.
so here, I mean, it could be the case though that there's a surge here, right? So typically what you can oftentimes happens is that people talk about legislation actually before it gets passed as well, because I mean, just because it happened in 65 doesn't mean, so you do see a little spike here in 64 of increased coverage.
Maybe just that feeling about immigrants is more largely a feeling about minorities, or a feeling about what minorities should gain, versus the feelings about immigrants are later.
Right. No, right. So once we, like I said, look in the content analysis, I can give you a much more precise response of what's going on there.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering if, like, in the few minorities that were surveyed in the NES in 2008, were there Asians included? And
52.
Yeah, it's definitely less than 100.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, in a perfect world,
They weren't asking Asians about Asians.
they would have they would have oversampled for Asians, but that would have involved interviewing and, you know, dozens of different language, which is just, I mean, so the oversample and interviewing in Spanish, that was already like a big achievement for NES. So yes, ideally I would have loved to extend this research and include all the major ethnic racial groups.
Although since it's still in person, right?
This is why it's so
that's
expensive.
Why, but that's also why I don't see how they could do a true multilingual Asian American sample in person. I think is virtually, I mean, it's so cost prohibitive. I can't imagine how you would isolate, right? I mean, I mean, not that you couldn't do it, but I'm just.
And also, you know, even so, I guess some of the things I just told on this related point, you know, if you look at the sample sizes, it's still not that big. I mean, so for, of course, whites, it's over 1,000, but what you're looking at here is, you know, your numbers drop to, you know, just under 500 and around 500 for Latinos too. So, you know, you would think that on a larger sample size, these cohort effects might have a more significant impact, whereas right now we're not, because, I mean, if you compare it, these are the sample is 3 times larger for the white population as well. Now you could do a similar study, but again, only restricted to Asian Americans if you were to use the Asian American survey.
Well, yeah, my suggestion was going to be whether this is the best survey to do this with. And then that it's got the ridiculously long name, the multi-city.
Oh yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. It has like 8,000 or 6,000. It's got this ridiculous acronym.
It's like
MCCP.
Yeah.
What is? Come on, students to know what it's called. Multi-city cultural. Blah, 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 blah. It's got a ridiculously long acronym, but it's got an N of 6,500 or 8,500. So it's got a huge N, and they're supposed to be releasing it soon. I have no idea. I haven't seen the.
I haven't seen
the instrument.
No.
I'm sorry. No, this is when there was a group of Karthik Ramakrishnan and Anjali Hancock, and there were a whole bunch of people
from, like, Southern California
who did it, and it's a huge sample, but it was specifically meant to be a comparative, you know, to finally be able to compare across multiple racial groups within one survey towards politics, opinions.
Right. Now I'm sorry to interrupt, but now it's ringing a bell.
And so I'm just wondering that would just because once you get into the cohorts, they're small, right? And so it would be a more robust way to to try to get at this, or maybe some of the Annenberg ones. I wonder if they ask questions.
They don't. So this is one.
But that's my question. My other suggestion was on the graph with the news coverage.
Yeah.
If you were to just put the number of immigrants on that graph, so you could have the line. It would just speak to the last question about are there spikes.
Yeah.
Because I would just be interested. I have a feeling the line doesn't go up as dramatically as the coverage does.
No, it doesn't. It's really
so I think that might be actually a really nice visual.
Because it
to
kind
put
of
that
like
together.
plateaus off towards the end. I mean, one of the drawbacks in at least the political science world is that for a long time we haven't really made it as practice to make these comparative studies, and so a lot of our surveys
do one group and then we do another group, and never shall the two groups speak
mostly
to one
just
another.
on
mostly one.
So it makes it hard to do these sorts of studies. So as a first cut, you know, given that these sample sizes are very large for this. Yeah, but absolutely, when that data set comes out,
Yeah.
that would be perfect.
You should, Karthik was saying, you should contact Karthik because he knows when it'll be.
Yeah, they're probably gonna want to publish it.
Well, he just presented a paper on it, and he said it should be
Okay, no, I'll let
released soon, so I would just ask him.
I have one question.
Sure.
Your final conclusion about less of a relationship in terms of towards immigrant policies,
Yeah.
but certainly a demonstrable impact on attitudes toward groups. I wonder, I guess it's too much of a how would we, let me see if I can phrase this. It would seem that those attitudes must somehow translate into
Sure.
some political perspective. So, what do you think we would need to do to try to explore? Because of course, one on the political side would be much more of a political actor. The supposition among political operatives is that what happened in '86, what happened in '96, or what could happen in with the president's executive order, or if there's ever immigration reform, will somehow translate into some political activity for one party or
Sure.
the other.
No, I
Beyond just motivating them to vote.
Sure. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think actually what I think is that I think these measures are doing a much better job of picking up how people actually feel. And so a lot of on these kind of more policy related questions as I define them, there can be a whole set of other factors that people are considering. But when you're asking directly about immigrants or a particular immigrant group, that's directly tapping into their feelings, which we could imagine is going to directly translate onto how they feel about immigration. And so sort of related to this, I'm working on another book project actually where we're looking at trends in immigration attitudes over time, and what we're actually finding is that, especially amongst white Americans, is that these immigration attitudes, what they're actually doing is moving white Americans to the right, so basically the Republican Party, pushing them. And this is we look from 1980 to today. And so you see this remarkable, as we know, this defection of white Americans to the Republican parties and controlling for all these other factors. What we're finding is that immigration abuse is having a substantial effect on their partisan attachments. And so what you're ending up getting is what we have now, right? The Republicans, which is increasingly becoming an all-white party, and Democrats becoming the party of minorities. And what we argue in this book project is that immigration is playing a major role in that.
I want to take issue with one thing that you just said, which is the Democratic Party being the party of minorities. I would push back and say the Democratic Party, and I'm not putting my hat on as a Democratic activist, but rather that a party that's more reflective of the country's entire demography.
Sure.
Because I think the media is very hot, and you're going to see this after the election, is very hot that sort of racializing the election in ways that I think completely ignore that Obama was elected with a multiracial electorate, right? And yes, more tilted towards African Americans and Latinos, but to discount the white vote that also went with him.
43%.
Right, is I think just, okay, it's not the majority, but that's because
It's a chunk.
it's a chunk, it's a sizable chunk, you know? So anyway, we play into the media's hype on the racialization.
Yeah. No, I mean, the media likes to make these simple categorizations, right? So that's an accurate assessment. It's just, no, I mean, it's a much more multicultural coalition as opposed to what's happening on the other side.
I wonder if another way to explain the differences is just that people don't necessarily know which policies are going to fix the immigration problem. Like, I wonder how much of it is just not knowing, you know what I mean? You're sort of assuming that those policy attitudes are going to map onto what you actually want, but not being sure that what that policy does is going to give you what you want. So I'm wondering if you could even put like how many people didn't answer those questions. So don't know, or you know, and how much that varied across groups. Because I have a feeling, I mean, it's related to all the political knowledge stuff, right? But I think that heterogeneity is probably a reflection of the fact that people were like, no, so you just kind of put the middle, or you say I don't know, rather than taking a position.
Well, and a lot of times people have really kind of conflicting or ambivalent attitudes towards immigration. Like they support, you know, helping children of undocumented immigrants, right? But at the same time want
to deport their parents.
Yeah, exactly. So the don't know part is a good, I don't know the answer to that, but that's, yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
I feel like some of the data you had kind of speaks to the issue that Lisa was raising already in terms of it's definitely comports with a pattern in other federal policy studies, right, where there's a general feeling, and then when it gets to the specificity, all the effects are weaker. You know, in terms of there is just less explanatory power and less sort of specificity in terms of people's actual policy feelings, but they have general notions of like affect. You know, and I was actually wondering sort of, you know, where the political behavior literature on sort of like what happens first, affect or support, and how those two are related would sort of fit into the narrative you're presenting. Just because because one of the controls that I was looking for, or I was always hoping for more independent variables. You know, just throw it out there, find some Asian Americans to interview, and everybody will be happy, including me. But was because your control for African Americans was change foreign-born in the state. And I was actually thinking that sort of a nicer, I guess, or more ideal measure would be either like residential ethnic density or something, or spatial integration, residential spatial integration. Just because I would get more at this question of, is this really a question of affect towards Latinos because illegal immigration is racialized, or is this really about support for immigration? And I thought that kind of a measure would sort of help sort of parse those out a little bit more.
Okay,
I don't know if you
So you mean looking at the percentage of blacks in
like a measure of racial segregation residentially or something like that, as opposed to
I'm just harder.